Welcome to today's video. Today we're going to be focusing on solving quadratic equations by using the quadratic formula, and we're going to show this mastery in class by scoring at least an 80% on an exit ticket. Hopefully you have the note sheet in front of you. If you don't, take out an extra sheet of paper. That way we can get you a fresh one tomorrow. Now, we're still solving quadratic equations, but this time we're going to use the quadratic formula. Here's the good news about the formula. It's on your formula sheet. So you don't have to memorize this formula, you just have to understand what the variables are. We already know what A, B, and C are from when we did factoring, so that doesn't change. Now we just have to take them and plug them into the equation. Our first step is still going to make sure it's in that quadratic form, ax squared plus bx plus c, just like we started when we were factoring. Then identify the A, B, and C, plug them in. We're going to simplify it all the way down, and then we're going to get our answers. So if we look at example 1, it wants to know what is the solution. It's the same thing as saying the x-intercepts, the roots, and the zeros. So it's already in the form ax squared plus bx plus c. A is 1, b is negative 8, and c is 16. Now, just so we have it on this page, I'm going to write negative b plus or minus the square root b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So if I use my numbers from this problem, b is negative 8, well it's a negative, so it becomes negative 8 plus or minus the square root. b is still negative 8 minus 4, a is 1, c is 16, all over 2 times 1. Now from here, it's just a matter of simplifying. Negative 8 makes a positive 8 there, plus or minus, well 8 squared is 64, minus 4 times 1 times 16 gives me 64, and 2 times 1 is 2. From here, I have 8 plus or minus the square root of 0 over 2. Now, in this case, the square root of 0 is just 0, so it becomes 8 plus or minus 0. It doesn't change our problem, so it's just 8 over 2, which equals 4. So our solution to that quadratic equation is 4. Make sure your answer is in those curly Q brackets. If it's in parentheses, it's wrong. That's symbolizing a point, not a solution. If we look at example 2, we want to find the roots. Again, finding the solution. So we're going to start by adding 7 on both sides. We want it in quadratic form. So we have x squared plus 8x plus 7 equals 0. Well, from here, a is 1, b is 8, and c is 7. So now I'm still using the same quadratic formula, just with different numbers. So I have negative b is 8 plus or minus the square root of 8 squared minus 4, a is 1, and c is 7, all over 2 times 1. Now, my suggestion, make sure you put your numbers in parentheses when you substitute them in. Because in this case, 8 squared is 64, but if you look at the last problem, negative 8 squared is also 64. We want that negative sign squared. From here, we simplify. We have negative 8 plus or minus the square root of 64 minus 28 all over 2. I'm left with negative 8 plus or minus the square root of 36 all over 2, which gives me negative 8 plus or minus 6 over, and not over 6, over 2. From here, we're going to break it into 2 separate problems. I'm going to make it negative 8 plus 6 over 2 and negative 8 minus 6 over 2. Well, negative 8 plus 6 is negative 2 over 2 gives me negative 1. On this side, negative 8 minus 6 is negative 14 over 2 gives me a negative 7. Both of those numbers are my solutions, so my answer would be negative 1 and negative 7. If we put them in increasing order, negative 7 comes first. But again, make sure your final answer is in those curly Q brackets. If you put negative 7 comma negative 1 in parentheses, that's a point on the graph. That's not our answer. Example 3 is asking for the x-intercepts. Now, what we want to get in the habit of doing is if it's an x-intercepts, we can either write it in the brackets or we can create points with them. I need to get it in standard quadratic form, so I'm going to add 7x and subtract 15 on both sides. And I'm going to get 4x squared plus 7x minus 15 equals 0. A is 4, B is 7, C is negative 15, so I have negative 7 plus or minus 7 squared minus 4, A is 4, negative 15 all over 2 times 4. From here, we're just simplifying, so I have negative 7 plus or minus the square root of 49 minus, well, 4 times negative 15 gives me a negative 240 all over 8. Well, this becomes negative 7 plus or minus the square root of 289 all over 8. One way to double check, make sure you're not getting the square root of a negative number. We can't take the square root of a negative number. That would tell us there's no solution. This simplifies down to negative 7 plus or minus 17 over 8. From here, we want to break it into two problems. We get negative 7 plus 17 over 8 and negative 7 minus 17 over 8. On this side, we end up with 10 over 8, but we always want to simplify our fractions, so we actually get 5 over 4. And on the other side, we end up with negative 3. So our answer would be negative 3 and 5 over 4. Because it asked for the x-intercepts, the other way you could write your answer is as points. And since it's an x-intercept, that means these are our x values and our y is 0. We would have 5 over 4, 0, and negative 3, 0. Either of those answers are acceptable. Now, if we look at example 4, it's asking us to find the zeros. Same steps, we still want to use the quadratic formula, except in this case, we have a GCF, so we're going to factor out a 2. We have k squared minus 2k minus 3 is equal to 0. From here, a becomes 1, b is negative 2, and c is negative 3. It becomes negative of negative 2, because we want to multiply b technically by a negative 1. Plus or minus the square root of negative 2 squared minus 4 times 1 times 3 all over 2a. If you notice, our equation doesn't say anything about that GCF, so we're just going to leave it on the outside. We don't have to worry about it. So it becomes 2 plus or minus the square root of 4 minus negative 12 over 2, which ends up with 2 plus or minus the square root of 16 over 2, which is 2 plus or minus the square root of 4. Ooh, and not the square root of 4. We took the square root of 16 and got 4. So from here, we want to break it into two problems. 2 plus 4 over 2 and 2 minus 4 over 2. From here, 2 plus 4 is 6, divided by 2 gives me 3. 2 minus 4 gives me a negative 2, divided by 2 gives me a negative 1. So my final solutions, or my zeros, are negative 1, 3. The biggest thing with the quadratic equation is just remembering to plug the numbers in correctly. If it's negative b and you already have a negative number, well, it's negative, negative in your number. You can't just drop the negative sign because there's already one there. Also, when you square it, a negative number squared is like saying negative 3 times negative 3. Well, you get a positive 9, not a negative 9. So just be careful when you're typing these problems in your calculator. There's 2 questions on the back. I want you to try them. There will be questions asking for your answers after this. Please bring your notes and any questions you have to class tomorrow. I look forward to seeing you then.